We've all had the dangers of inegalitarian racism drummed into us constantly, so much so that the dangers of egalitarian assumptions, in this sense meaning that all identifiable races, sexes, ethnic groups, etc. are cognitively equal, have been ignored. For example, let's say Sweden wants to bring in 1 million black Africans under the assumption that by speaking the same language, going to the same schools, and being in the same quote-unquote cultural milieu, over time these immigrants will become black Swedes. Behaviorally indistinguishable from white Swedes, they'll just look a little bit different. What if this is wrong? What if their behavior is innately distinct from that of white Swedes, and the current violent crime rates, drainage on the government budget, and support for socialist parties that these black immigrants have are a result of something innate and, for the foreseeable future, permanent? We could look at affirmative action. Affirmative action is predicated on the notion that the identified races are cognitively equal, and therefore any performance disparity is treated as prima facie evidence that the performance gaps are a result of discrimination, which has morphed into this invisible and unverifiable implicit discrimination, or the effects of prior oppression which can't be verified or falsified, or some invisible system of white privilege. Anything but innate genetic differences. All this leads to egalitarian racism. Examples of egalitarian racism